Alrighty guys, a very warm welcome to the video. Today we're discussing this case here, which is an Ironman age group athlete who was competing in the Ironman World Championships in Kona, and a very distressing scene, really. It's never nice to see an athlete go down like this. It's never nice to see someone in this state of distress. If we're absolutely honest with ourselves, this is an acute medical emergency. And so I'm doing this video for as a word of caution to any other athletes out there who may otherwise be able to prevent something like this. Whether or not she could have prevented it, I'm not saying that's the case, but at the end of the day, it's an important thing to be aware of. And what is that? That is the effects of heat and heat stroke or hyperthermia on the body, and particularly on the brain function, your conscious state, your capacity, cognitive function, all that kind of stuff. Because it is not something that you want to be, this state is not something you want to be kind of getting into at any stage, whether that's during training or whatnot. So there are many causes as to what, can cause a delirium or reduced cognitive capacity, or this state of confusion and real inability to control the body and understand, where one is really. And with acute exercise, I guess the main ones are going to be dehydration as a primary cause. We can also have hypoglycaemia, which is when we have our blood sugars come down too low. So normally we would sit in a nice range of blood sugar and kind of go up and down in that. But if we drop too low, we can become hypoglycemic. And if we don't get enough glucose and sugar to the brain, that can cause this state of delirium, reduced consciousness, awareness of where we are. So that can be a cause. So we have dehydration, so lack of fluid. We have hypoglycemia, so lack of carbohydrates in the blood going to the brain. We can also have states like hyponatremia, which is hyponatremia is a low blood sodium level that can cause similar to dehydration, but essentially it's going to cause like the opposite. So overhydration, really, because we have low blood sodium. Essentially, our cells are going to swell, and that is not going to be good. That can cause, we have the balance of electrolytes in the cells and out of the cells. And if we have low electrolytes in the cells, or out of the cells, I should say, the fluid is going to be diffusing into those cells. And so that causes them to swell, and not at all something you want, and definitely something which can have an effect on our conscious state when we have the brain or that cerebral swelling. So there are a few things that can cause it from the outset, or some more, I guess, obvious causes. However, one thing is, and I guess all of this really, compounds, and it's not always just one case or like one causative factor or the other, but a big causative factor, and often is the case, particularly in an Ironman like the one in Kona, where it's quite warm, is heat stroke. So this is often coupled with dehydration, because when we dehydrate, we lose a lot of a large proportion of our capacity to regulate our body temperature. So dehydration, compounds this effect, but heat stroke is really a primary causative factor for this, altered neurological cognitive state in which we see this athlete really in here. So I want to run through this study and just take out the key points of information that can really be of benefit to you guys. And also, it does concern me a lot when we see athletes in this state, and still now in this day and age, knowing what we know, knowing not only the acute consequences on the athlete's health, but also the long-term potential implications for athletes' health being in a state like this, is almost an appeal to Ironman, just to say, hey, come on guys, if you see an athlete like this, don't let them keep fighting to the finish for that long. Maybe, let it go on for, half a minute, but this athlete was there for 2-3 minutes and trying to get up that finish line. And obviously it's, we want to see the stories, we want the, and full credit to this lady. There was an incredible display of strength and grit. But I do really worry at the end of the day, because what's the primary, what's the priority? It's our health. And we can always come back into an Ironman, but we can't always come back and reverse the negative consequences on our health of something like severe heat stroke. So the neurological and cognitive consequences of hyperthermia. This is just a review article, quite a recent one as well. But essentially, we'll have a read through and take away the key points and what you guys can really, I guess, benefit from. So, and background, an elevated temperature by whatever cause, infective or non-infective, affects many organ systems of the body, sometimes with damage which is irreversible and may lead to death. A temperature of 37.5 or greater at any point during an admission to the intensive care unit tends towards a worse outcome and becomes significant at temperatures greater than 38.5 degrees Celsius. There is emerging evidence that the central nervous system is especially vulnerable to hyperthermia, particularly if prolonged or excessive, which is why, when we talk about this stuff, early intervention in someone when they're in this state is quite important, particularly for their short-term and long-term outcomes. And, we can kind of read through, but I'll dive into the study now. This can be caused by many different factors like we've spoken about, but also just one thing to be aware of, like the actual physiology of it. Our hypothalamus in our brain is the small portion of our brain really that regulates body temperature. So if we're too cold or too warm, we will start to, see the physical manifestations of that. So if we're cold, the hypothalamus will essentially instruct our muscles to start shivering. If we're too warm, the hypothalamus basically tells the body to stop doing what it's doing in order to try and cool down. So that's when we see this altered conscious state, and we really see athletes just kind of collapsing. That's the body saying, hey, look, we need to stop because we need to cool down. And if you keep running, it's not going to be all that great. So cognitive dysfunction, neurological effects, delirium. We have these acute effects. You're going to see things like constricted pupils. You're going to see, a whole lot of neurological changes. However, we can see persisting deficits, and, we can also see some ischemia even to the brain if it goes on too long. This is in extreme cases. Often in like an Ironman or something like this, it's not going to be the case, but you never know, and you don't want to run the risk because we have seen athletes with very severe outcomes. So, obviously this is a lengthy article, excitotoxicity, heat shock proteins. I love this science stuff, but it's really probably not all that important in terms of the actual what you guys need to know in order to prevent this and what to be aware of. So this is the main stuff. So systemic effects of hyperthermia, blood-brain barrier disruption, and the development of edema. So this is really important. The blood-brain barrier is this tightly monitored, or this barrier in which it essentially protects the brain from toxins that are in the blood, right? So you don't want that ever compromised. We can actually compromise the blood-brain it's a tongue twister, the blood-brain barrier, if we have excessive hypothermia. So that's important to note. Definitely not something that you want. Also, edema, that's swelling of the brain, too much fluid, which of course is a medical emergency. We also have gut translocation. So this is when we can have increased permeability of the blood or the gut itself, which can, increase the rate of bacteria from the gut going into the blood, which of course is not something that you'd ever want. That can lead to sepsis and all that kind of stuff. Unlikely. What's more likely though is that the blood that's actually supplying the gut with oxygen gets kind of redirected away from the gut itself to the brain and to those vital organs, the heart, the lungs, everything that you're needing to survive in the acute setting. And this can actually cause essentially ischemia, which is low oxygen to areas of the gut. And then it can cause death of the actual gut tissue itself. And this is what Chris Lee, the Australian, had at Kona 20 odd years ago. He had essentially, he finished the race, or he didn't finish. He actually I don't think he finished. He actually got taken away on a stretcher, but he was, a few hundred meters from the finish line and collapsed and tried to crawl to the finish line, but couldn't get there. They took him away on a stretcher, and he was so hyperthermic and so dehydrated that his gut had suffered such low oxygen for too long that they actually had to remove some of his intestine. So obviously, and that's life-changing. That's life-changing for your athletic capacity, but also your life in general. This goes beyond just your future capacity to participate in sports. Heavy metal toxicity, again, damage to the blood-brain barrier. Any heavy metals that are in the blood can then access the brain, which otherwise they shouldn't be. And so there is a whole lot of adverse consequences that can kind of result from this. So conclusion, hyperthermia is a common insult to the central nervous system. A variety of neurocognitive effects are reported, which in some cases may persist after the acute insult. Really important takeaway. Changes take place at lower temperatures following shorter periods of time than may have been previously appreciated. In long-term cases, cerebellar, so this is the brain itself, damage predominates, though thought to be a result of sensitivity of Purkinje cells, to thermal damage. Again, we don't need to kind of dive too far into all this science, but essentially, there's a potential for brain damage. There's a potential for long-term inflammation in the brain, long-term neurological consequences, and not something at all that you really want to be undergoing. So again, to kind of summarize, we'll read through this last bit of the conclusion because often that's like the key takeaway of the studies. So it is not clear which patients are most at risk, but it is likely that the individual's physiological response, as well as the duration of hypothermia, so very important to get onto this early, may be important. Further work is needed to clarify how genotype, so your actual genetics themselves, and phenotype, so how you express them, differences predispose an individual to developing neurological deficits. Current treatment is essentially limited to urgent cooling by physical methods, such as eliciting the pathogenesis of neurological deficits, may allow development of additional treatment. Of interest is the role of inflammatory response, So essentially, what are future potential roles for this? This is not in the domain of like what I'm trying to get across here. Essentially, at the end of the day, what I really want to convey is that this state that we're seeing can be caused from many things: dehydration, low blood sodium, hypoglycaemia, so low blood sugar. But the main one often in a race like Kona is hyperthermia, and often it's a combination of many things, not just one. And obviously, there's a lot more research that we will do in this field, I'm sure. Not me, but researchers will do in this field. And we will, really understand a lot of these long-term implications a lot better. But we know already, Chris Lee had some of his intestine removed. Not at all good. And you don't want to be putting your blood-brain barrier in a compromised state. You don't want to be putting yourself at, potential, even opening up the potential for long-term consequences in terms of neurological function, in terms of brain function and health, So I think that this is in my opinion, this is just my opinion, this is actually a problem with endurance sports like Ironman, that they don't have a policy which says, hey, as soon as we see someone starting to get towards this state, and definitely when someone's in that state, we need to pull them out of that state as soon as possible and get them urgent medical care. Because, this might seem a bit blunt, but who cares if you finish the Ironman when you were previously 100% healthy and now you are going to suffer for the rest of your life, potentially. I'm sure and I hope that this woman got medical care and she was fine, and it is a fantastic effort. I'm not saying that, this is not even referring to her specifically. This is referring to generally from a medical standpoint. Hyperthermia is an acute medical crisis, and we need to really prioritize athletes getting urgent medical care and not leaving them out there just suffering, hopelessly trying to get to the finish line, because when you're in that state, you really don't know what you're doing. And it doesn't, who cares if you get to the finish line or not? You know, you're now thinking about, or your body's now thinking about, will we survive as the most important thing? You know, so you start out the race and you want to have a good race, and then you're finishing the race and it's like, I want to survive, I don't want to live. You know, so I think we need to start paying more attention to this. I think it goes on too long in terms of how long athletes are left out there on the actual course itself without help. And, you know, let me know what you guys think. Have you ever been in this state? Have you suffered any long-term consequences? How long did it take to recover from? What was the treatment? Like I said, many causes. There's other causes as well. Medications even can cause this. You know, stimulants can cause this. ADHD medications, Ritalin, Adderall, anything that increases the basal metabolic temperature or the body's temperature. Even the SSRI antidepressants can alter the how the hypothalamus responds to heat. So like all of this stuff can impact it. But generally, something we really need to be careful of. And if you are an athlete and starting to get towards that state, you know, don't worry about, if you can, put the ego aside. This is just generally speaking, because your health is more important than finishing a race. So let me know what you guys think. And I will see you in the next video.